I have written nonfiction books on a wide variety of topics, from George Washington to X-rays to Marie Curie to Varian Fry, an American Holocaust rescuer, to tech titans like Bill Gates and Steve Jobs and others. So when I begin a project, I really know very little about my topics. And as I begin to do the research, I sort of go on a treasure hunt. That's the way I like to look at it. And I use primary sources in order to gather the material that I need to write nonfiction books that are not only accurate, but hopefully interesting as well. So when I began to look into this book about George Washington and decided to write this book, I really began with George Washington in the very same way. I knew very little about Washington. I'd heard, of course, that he had chopped down the cherry tree, which he didn't. And I had heard that he wore a wig, which he didn't. And I'd heard that he wore wooden teeth, which he didn't. So I found out very quickly the things that I thought I knew about George Washington were absolutely not any of them correct. So as I began this book, which I describe as CSI meets the biography channel, and you'll see why as we go along, it's really been a treat for me to replace all of those myths with the facts about George Washington. The premise of the book is really this: did George Washington really look like his image on the $1 bill? When Mount Vernon did some research, they found that most Americans would describe this image of George Washington, taken from the Athenaeum portrait, as old, boring, and grumpy. And of course, they realized they were going to have to change that way of looking at the father of our country. They devised a plan in which they would create 3 life-size figures of George Washington and show him at the ages of 19, at 45, and at 57. And to do this, they really compiled a team from the experts from all over the world. The first one that came to the project was Dr. Jeffrey Schwartz, who is a physical anthropologist, and he began the project. From there, it went, he gathered then other experts, and they all began with these 3 pieces of art. These were all done by Jean-Antoine Houdon, who was a famous master sculptor of the day, of Washington's day. And he actually came to Mount Vernon to observe Washington. And while he was there, he created the life mask that you see on the right side. And he also created the bust that you see on the left side, and gave the bust to Washington as a parting gift when he left. When he went back to his studio in Paris, he created this beautiful marble statue that is still at the Virginia State Capitol in Richmond. So there's no doubt that these 3 pieces of art show what George Washington looked like at the age of 53. So these were the gold standards for this whole project. From there, they got the help of Dr. Anshuman Rosdan, who was with the Prism Laboratory at Arizona State University. And they devised a way to scan all of these priceless artifacts in a way that would not damage them. So as you see, this is actually the Washington bust being done with the laser scan there. And on this bottom left, you see where all of that information was fed into a computer system, and it sort of made a mesh that was an exact replica of that bust. So they did many of the artifacts this way, and as they did, they were able to study them, and they were able then to get all of these various measurements that were from George Washington, because as a master sculptor, Houdon would have measured every part of his body. So when they had all of that information, the other thing that was necessary for them to figure out is the one thing that every school child knows about George Washington, and that is that he had dentures. He did indeed have dentures, and these are actually the dentures that George Washington actually had in his mouth at some point in his life. I like to point out when I do school visits, the one on the top left, as you see that spring there is really a heinous looking thing there. So every time now when I look at the dollar bill and I see that picture of George Washington, I envision a denture very much like this one in his mouth, and I have a lot of sympathy for him. At the time, he would have struggled to keep that in his mouth, and he would have been really sort of embarrassed about the way that it made his mouth look. But these dentures actually play a very important role in this process. What they were able to do with this is determine, because of that denture, determine the shape of his jaw. And every step along the way, they then put that information to see if it fit perfectly within that bust, because this was the gold standard. If it didn't fit there, then it wasn't right. So as the project moved along, the science end of it came to a close, and they ended up with these 3 incredible computer files of George Washington as he would have looked at 19, at 45, and 57. Now you can see that there is actually quite a lot of difference in these images if you look closely. At 19 years of age, he would have had a much longer face than he did later in life. As he lost teeth, as he did throughout his life, his face would have appeared shorter and shorter. So this information really was an important part. When the computer files were finished, it went to a foam head and then to a wax and then to a clay head. But once again, it took the skill of a master sculptor, and this is Stuart Williamson. It took Stuart to then take that information and those clay heads and really craft into those heads and those faces an expression and a moment in time, the wrinkles, the concern that you see on his face. It took a master sculptor once again to accomplish. From there, as you see on the left, those clay heads were then turned into wax heads. Then when the wax heads were finished, these eyeballs were placed in those heads. Because if you think about it, if their eyeballs were wax, they would never look real. But they put these in beautiful acrylic eyeballs, and there's no doubt that George Washington's eye color was blue-gray. Many people of his day wrote about the color of his eyes, so there's no doubt about that. So as the project sort of moved along, it went really to the pure art end of things. I really had a very fortunate experience when I was doing the work for this book, because I had the incredible opportunity to go to Mount Vernon when they were doing the yearly maintenance of these 3 figures. And these, on the left is Diana Cordray, who's the Mount Vernon Education Center manager, and in the middle is Sue Day, who is an incredible artist, as you will see, and on the right is Stephen Horak, a magnificent wig master. And so while I was there, I was able to really see these figures as they were maintained and see what they looked like and what they felt like. And then I was, of course, able to ask all of the questions that I needed to ask, and to ask all the things that I'd asked when I was a little girl. You know, how long did it take you, and what's it made out of, and why, and why, and why, and then what happened? So this is really was a wonderful opportunity for me to see these figures as they were being worked on, and see them up close, and see how they really went about creating them. Sue Day is not only the artist that you will see in a moment, but she's also the one who put the hairline into each of the 3 figures of George Washington. You can see that here in this slide, she is putting one human hair at a time directly into the wax, and in this way it looks like the hair is actually growing out of his head. It's really critical to get the hairline right on these figures, and she's constantly checking against all of these images of George Washington, because if the hairline was not correct, then none of it would look right. So she, one by one, she used this tool to put in that hairline, and she did so for each of these figures. It's painstaking work. Also, there's no doubt what color George Washington's hair was. The reason there's no doubt is that there are many locks of his hair that still exist today, and